December 20th, 1943. The winter sky over northern Germany was the color of steel, cold, empty, unforgiving. High above the clouds, a crippled American bomber struggled to stay airborne. Inside it, 10 young men clung to life, and closing fast behind them came a German fighter pilot who could end it all with one squeeze of the trigger. The man in that fighter was Franz Stigler, a seasoned Luftwaffe ace with 22 victories to his name. He had already survived deserts, mountains, and countless battles. Now one more kill would earn him the Knight's Cross, Germany's most coveted military decoration. Through the glass of his Messerschmitt Bf-109, he saw his prey, a battered Boeing B-17, its tail shredded, smoke pouring from its engines, glass shattered by flak. Inside, he could see movement. Men slumped over their stations, the glint of blood on metal, hands still gripping useless guns. He steadied his aim. Then he hesitated. Something about that scene, those broken faces behind the wreckage, stopped him cold. To understand why, you have to know who Franz Stigler was. He had been born in 1915 in the Bavarian town of Regensburg, the son of a World War I pilot. Flying was part of his bloodline. He grew up around hangars and open fields, watching canvas-winged biplanes claw their way into the sky. By the age of 12, he could already handle the controls of a glider. By his 20s, he had logged thousands of hours as a flight instructor. When war returned to Europe in 1939, Stigler didn't hesitate. He joined the Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force. He trained under some of the most respected aces in the service, among them Gustav Rödel, a man who believed that even in combat there were rules. Rules meant to keep a soldier human. Rödel's lesson was simple. You fight with honor. You do not kill for sport. You never shoot a man who cannot fight back. Those words would echo in Stigler's mind for the rest of his life. By late 1943, Germany was under siege from above. Day after day, waves of American bombers crossed the Channel, striking at factories, shipyards, and rail lines. For the Luftwaffe pilots, it was a desperate defense. Fuel was scarce, replacement pilots were inexperienced, and losses were mounting. Yet men like Stigler kept flying, bound by duty and instinct. That December morning, he took off from Jever Airfield, northwest of Bremen, after a brief refuel. He had already fought earlier that day and barely escaped with his life. As he taxied in, mechanics ran toward him, pointing frantically to the horizon. "Ein B-17," they shouted. A lone American bomber was limping past the airfield at barely 1,000 meters, smoke trailing behind it like a dying comet. Stigler didn't think twice. He throttled up, the engine's roar shaking the ground, and lifted off in pursuit. This would be an easy kill. A straggler, far from its formation, no escorts, no chance. He could almost taste the Knight's Cross. As the Messerschmitt closed the distance, he switched from the clinical calm of pursuit to the mechanical rhythm of attack. Throttle steady, guns armed, angle calculated. But when he came alongside, what he saw through his canopy was not what he expected. The B-17 looked as if a giant hand had torn it apart. Huge holes gaped in the fuselage, the tail section hung by metal strands. The top turret was gone. Through those holes, Stigler could see the men inside, some bleeding, some motionless. He edged closer, steadying his craft just off their right wing. The pilot's window was shattered. Through it, he saw the American captain, young, barely more than a boy, fighting to keep the plane steady. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, Stigler's training, ambition, and survival instincts collided. He could destroy them and be praised for it. Or he could spare them and be executed. Inside his head, he heard Rödel's voice again. You follow the rules of war for yourself, not for your enemy. What he was looking at wasn't an enemy target anymore. It was a flying coffin filled with wounded men who had already lost the fight. Back in the bomber, that young pilot, Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old from West Virginia, was barely conscious. It was his first mission as aircraft commander, and it had gone catastrophically wrong. Their target had been the aircraft factories of Bremen. They had reached the objective, dropped their bombs, and immediately come under relentless attack. Flak had torn through their formation, fighters had swarmed them. Ye Old Pub, as they had named their bomber, had taken multiple hits. Engine 2 destroyed, Engine 4 leaking oil. oxygen lines cut. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was dead, several others badly wounded. The temperature outside was 40 degrees below zero, and the interior of the bomber was a freezer full of smoke and blood. Still, Brown refused to bail out. He was determined to get his crew home. He coaxed the damaged aircraft westward, alone, flying low to avoid radar. They had almost no ammunition left and no working turrets. And now, to make matters worse, a German fighter had appeared on their wingtip. Through the cracks in the windshield, the crew could see the black cross on the Messerschmitt. Someone shouted, "He's coming in to finish us." But instead of attacking, the Germans simply flew beside them, matching their speed. Inside the B-17, confusion reigned. The gunners, half frozen and bleeding, tried to swing their guns toward the fighter, but most of the mounts were destroyed. The ball turret was jammed. They waited for the inevitable burst of cannon fire. It never came. Stigler waved from his cockpit. He gestured down, signaling for them to land. Surrender. Charlie Brown shook his head. He knew that landing in Germany meant capture. He'd rather die trying to reach England. Stigler nodded slightly, as if he understood. He eased forward, positioning his Messerschmitt just ahead and to the left of the bomber, where ground observers could see him. If any German flak batteries or anti-aircraft guns spotted the American plane, they would also see the German fighter flying escort. They'd assume it was a damaged aircraft, being guided in for landing and hold their fire. It was an insane risk. If his superiors saw him protecting the enemy, he'd face a court-martial and a firing squad. But he stayed. For more than 10 minutes, they flew together like that, hunter and prey, transformed into companions. Below them, villages and fields slid past. Ahead lay the thin grey line of the North Sea. Every minute was a gamble. Every second could be the one that got him killed. Finally, as they crossed the German coastline, Stigler knew it was time. His fuel was low, and to go any farther meant almost certain detection. He pulled up alongside the cockpit one last time. Charlie Brown looked over, eyes wide, exhausted. Franz Stigler raised his gloved hand in a crisp salute. Then he rolled his fighter away, dipping his wings in farewell, and vanished back toward Germany. Inside Ye Old Pub, no one spoke for a long moment. Then, quietly, someone muttered, "What the hell just happened?" Charlie didn't have an answer. He only knew that the enemy had just saved them. The bomber limped across the North Sea, engines coughing, altitude barely 1,000 feet. When they reached the British coast, they made an emergency landing at an RAF airfield. The landing gear barely held. When the aircraft came to rest, ground crews swarmed around it, stunned. The fuselage was riddled with holes the size of fists. The tail section was practically shredded. One look and everyone agreed. The fact it had flown at all was a miracle. The B-17 was written off, too damaged ever to fly again. The men somehow survived. During debriefing, Charlie Brown tried to explain what had happened. The German fighter who had refused to shoot, who had even escorted them out of danger. His commanding officers exchanged uneasy glances. They told him firmly to keep quiet. If word spread that enemy pilots were showing mercy, it could confuse morale, blur the lines between right and wrong. So the incident was buried. Charlie told his crew not to mention it again. He would remember it for the rest of his life. Not as a tale of survival, but as a question that haunted him. Who was that pilot? Meanwhile, back in Germany, Franz Stigler returned to his base, landed his aircraft and said nothing. He cleaned his guns, filed no report, and kept the secret to himself. To admit he had spared an enemy bomber would have been suicide. In the eyes of the Reich, mercy was weakness, and weakness was treason. He continued flying until war's end, dodging death dozens of times. When Germany finally collapsed, Stigler surrendered to American forces. He had lost friends, his homeland was in ruins, and the code of honor that had guided him seemed like a relic from another age. In 1953, he left Europe behind, immigrating to Canada to start fresh. He built a business repairing airplanes, married and tried to forget the war. But he never forgot the faces inside that bomber or the salute they had shared above the North Sea. And so, for the next 40 years, two men, one American, one German, carried the same memory on opposite sides of the ocean. Each wondered if the other had survived. Each wondered what had become of the man he once met as an enemy and remembered as a brother. For the men of Ye Olde Pub, the war didn't end when their wheels touched the runway. They survived that flight, yes, but they carried it home with them. Charlie Brown's crew was scattered soon after their return to England. Some went back into the air, some were reassigned. One or two never flew again. And their pilot, 21 years old, exhausted, wounded in body and spirit, was told to forget the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to him. "Don't speak of it," the intelligence officer said flatly during debriefing. "If it got out that the enemy showed mercy, it could soften morale. The Germans aren't human in this war, understand?" Charlie nodded because he had to, but inside he disagreed. He'd looked that German pilot in the eyes. He had seen humanity there. He completed his tour, flew his remaining missions, and then went home to the hills of West Virginia. The war had hardened him, aged him far beyond his years. But the night skies stayed with him. When he closed his eyes, he saw tracer fire ripping through clouds. He smelled smoke and hydraulic fluid. He felt the frozen air clawing at his skin. And always, always, there was the memory of that silver Messerschmitt flying beside him like a ghost. He never told anyone the full story, at first because he was ordered not to, later because he didn't know how. How do you explain something so impossible? How do you tell people that mercy had saved you, not luck? The nightmares lingered. His wife would sometimes wake in the middle of the night to find him sitting upright, drenched in sweat, staring at nothing. When she asked what was wrong, he would say softly, "Just the old bomber again." He tried to move on. He went to college on the GI Bill, earned a degree, and eventually rejoined the Air Force in the new Cold War era. He served in Vietnam, Laos, and places he never spoke of later. Then, in 1972, after more than 3 decades in uniform and government service, he retired to Miami. On the surface, life was good. He invented small devices, repaired machinery, raised a family, and grew older. But some memories never fade. And for Charlie Brown, one question refused to die. Who was that German pilot? Across the Atlantic, in the quiet suburbs of Vancouver, another man was haunted by the same memory. Franz Stigler had made a life for himself in Canada. He ran a successful business, kept a small private plane at a local airfield, and rarely spoke of the war. When neighbors asked about his accent or his past, he would smile politely and change the subject. Inside, though, he carried the same ghosts. He had survived the collapse of the Reich, the bombings, the chaos, the hunger. He'd seen his homeland torn apart, friends killed or captured. But the day that lingered was December 20th, 1943, the day he had let the enemy go. Sometimes, when the hum of a passing aircraft reached his workshop, he'd look up automatically, scanning the sky as if expecting to see that battered B-17 again, limping toward England. He told almost no one about it. It wasn't something a man bragged about in Germany after the war. And later in Canada, people weren't eager to hear from former Luftwaffe pilots. Still, he wondered, did they make it? Did the young Americans survive? He could never know. There was no way to find out. No internet, no veterans' databases, no bridge between former enemies. And so, for more than 40 years, both men lived in silence, two sides of the same memory, never realizing that the other still breathed under the same sky. Then, in 1986, something shifted. That summer, Boeing Corporation hosted an event in Boston called the Gathering of Eagles, a reunion of combat aviators from every nation and every era. Charlie Brown, now 64, was invited as a veteran of the 8th Air Force. He wasn't sure he wanted to go. But his daughter encouraged him, saying, "Dad, maybe it'll be good for you to be around other pilots again." He went. Inside the crowded ballroom, surrounded by men in blazers and service caps, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the electricity of shared experience. There were British Spitfire aces, American bomber crews, even a few former German pilots who now lived in the West. During one panel, a moderator asked the veterans, "Can any of you remember a mission that changed the way you saw the war?" Charlie paused. He'd never told this story in public. But something in the room, the atmosphere of reconciliation perhaps, loosened the lock on his silence. He raised his hand and spoke. He told them about Bremen, about the crippled bomber, the dead tail gunner, the freezing air. He described the German fighter that had appeared beside them, the salute, the escort, the impossible mercy. When he finished, the room was utterly still. Then someone asked, "Did you ever try to find that pilot?" Charlie blinked. He realized he had never truly tried. That night in his hotel room, he couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the question, and in that sleepless darkness, he made a decision. He would find him. The next morning, he began writing letters to the US Air Force archives, to German military historians, to veterans associations. He asked for any record of Luftwaffe activity near Bremen on December 20th, 1943. Weeks became months. The replies trickled in, but none had answers. Records destroyed, files incomplete, some captured by the Soviets, others lost in bombings. He refused to give up. He spoke to historians, searched old mission logs, even contacted the German embassy. Every path led to a dead end. He learned that the Luftwaffe's meticulous combat records were scattered after the war. Finding one pilot from one mission was like chasing smoke in the wind. Still, the need burned inside him. Sometimes, in the quiet of his Miami home, he'd look out over the ocean and imagine a Messerschmitt soaring above those same waters decades earlier. He could almost see the salute again. By 1989, frustration turned to obsession. He wrote out a detailed account of the encounter, the time, the date, the position, the markings on the German aircraft, and sent it to Combat Pilots International, a small newsletter read by both Allied and German veterans. He waited. For weeks, nothing. Then the calendar turned to January 1990. A letter arrived from Canada. The return address bore a name he didn't know, F. Stigler. Charlie opened it carefully. The first line stopped his heart. "I was the one." He read it again, lips trembling. The letter went on to describe the very scene he had carried in his mind for nearly half a century: the wounded crew, the holes in the fuselage, the escort to the sea. The words were written in careful English, simple and sincere. For a long moment, Charlie just sat there, staring at the paper, the decades collapsing between two men who had once been enemies in the frozen air. He picked up the phone. When the line clicked and a German accent answered, he said, "This is Charlie Brown. Are you the man who spared my crew?" There was a pause. Then quietly, "Yes, my friend. I am." They spoke for hours, two old pilots, their lives shaped by the same 10 minutes of mercy. Franz described his aircraft, his base, the risk he'd taken. Charlie told him about the aftermath, the silence, the long years of wondering. When they hung up, Charlie felt lighter than he had in decades. For the first time in 47 years, he knew the truth. And for Franz Stigler, it was the peace he had been waiting for, proof that the men he spared had lived. In that moment, across thousands of miles, both men finally came home. 6 months after that first phone call, two men who once tried to destroy each other prepared to meet face to face. It was the summer of 1990 in Seattle, Washington, nearly half a century since they had last looked at one another through cracked glass and gun smoke. Charlie Brown, now 68, stood nervously at the edge of a small airfield. The wind was cool, the sky a perfect shade of blue, the kind of sky pilots never forget. His hands trembled as he adjusted his tie. He kept glancing at the horizon, searching for the car that carried his old enemy, or rather his new friend. A few hundred yards away, a sedan rolled to a stop. The door opened, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped out, Franz Stigler. For a moment they just stared at each other. Two faces aged by time, two lives lived in parallel, both shaped by the same 10 minutes in 1943. Then Franz began to walk toward him. Charlie met him halfway. Neither man spoke. They simply embraced, the crowd around them fading to nothing. Cameras clicked, but it didn't matter. When they finally pulled apart, Franz whispered the first words either could find, "I love you, Charlie." Charlie's eyes filled with tears. "I know," he said. "I love you too." They spent that day together, talking without end. Franz described what it had looked like from his cockpit: the torn fuselage, the holes large enough to crawl through, the tail gunner already dead. He told Charlie how he'd heard his commander's voice in his mind, reminding him what it meant to be an honorable pilot. Charlie, in turn, told him about the chaos inside Ye Old Pub, the panic, the wounded men, the blood freezing on the floor, the disbelief when the German refused to fire. Each man carried half of the story. Now, finally, the two halves fit together. Later that evening, Charlie introduced Franz to surviving members of his crew. When they shook his hand, there were no words, only tears, gratitude, and the shared understanding that without this man, none of them would have been standing there. At dinner, laughter replaced solemn silence. They told stories, toasted absent friends, and marveled at how life had turned one act of mercy into a bond stronger than blood. In the months that followed, the friendship deepened. They wrote letters constantly, long pages filled with memories, reflections, and small talk about weather and family. They began calling each other every Sunday afternoon, no matter where they were. Sometimes the calls lasted hours, sometimes just a few minutes, but neither missed one. They met again later that year at an aviation gathering in Florida, standing side by side beneath the wing of a restored B-17. Franz traced his fingers along the riveted metal and said softly, "I remember these shapes." "Even after all these years?" Charlie laughed. "I bet you do." You saw them up close. For both men, those meetings were like therapy. The nightmares that had haunted Charlie for decades began to fade. Franz, who had long wrestled with guilt over the many lives he had taken, finally found peace in the life he had saved. They began telling their story publicly, at schools, veterans' halls, air shows. Not for fame, but because people needed to hear it. When they spoke together, they didn't sound like former enemies. They sounded like brothers who had fought on opposite sides of the same tragedy. At one event, Charlie said to the audience, "The man standing next to me gave me my life. Everything I am, my family, my children, my grandchildren, all of it exists because he made a choice. Not as a German, not as a soldier, but as a human being." Franz stood quietly beside him, tears gathering in his eyes. When it was his turn to speak, he said, "That day, when I saw his bomber, I thought of my brother. He was killed earlier in the war. I couldn't bring him back, but I could give these men a chance to go home. I followed my conscience, not my orders." The room was silent except for soft sobbing. From that day on, the world began to rediscover their story. Two pilots who had every reason to hate each other, but chose instead to forgive. They became inseparable. Whenever they traveled together, people stared in wonder. The American and the German, laughing like old friends. Their wives became close as well. Jackie Brown and Haya Stigler wrote each other letters, sent photos of grandchildren, traded recipes, and called across time zones. It was as if two families, once separated by war, had become one. In 1995, during a visit to Charlie's home in Miami, Franz handed him a small wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound pilot's logbook. On the first page, in neat handwriting, were the words, "In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother Franz." Charlie stared at the inscription for a long time before closing the book and hugging him. No medals, no honors, no speeches could have meant more. As their story spread, journalists came calling, articles appeared in aviation magazines and newspapers. Television crews recorded interviews where they sat side by side, smiling, finishing each other's sentences, but not everyone approved. In Germany, a few old veterans muttered that Franz had betrayed his comrades. In Canada, some who learned of his past refused to see beyond the uniform he'd once worn. When asked about it, Franz simply said, "They don't understand. But Charlie does." That's enough. He had long ago stopped caring about medals or reputation. What mattered now was the friendship that had come from his single act of mercy. Charlie often told reporters, "Franz is like a brother to me, maybe even more than a brother. He saved my crew and he saved me from carrying hate for the rest of my life." Their story reached audiences across the world. Schools began teaching it as an example of moral courage. Pilots told it to their cadets. At military academies, instructors played recordings of their interviews and asked young officers, "What would you have done?" Even hardened veterans were moved to tears. One of them told Franz after a talk, "You reminded me that honor doesn't come from following orders. It comes from listening to your conscience." By the early 2000s, both men were well into their 80s. They moved slower now, spoke more softly, but their bond never weakened. When one of them fell ill, the other called every day to check in, and every conversation ended the same way. Franz would say, "Goodbye, my brother in the skies." Charlie would answer, "Until we meet again, Franz." Sometimes they would sit together at air shows, watching the old warbirds thunder past overhead. The B-17, the Mustangs, the Spitfires, and they would fall quiet. In those moments, their minds drifted back to that winter sky in 1943, when two planes met by chance and two men changed each other's lives forever. When the crowd around them saw them sitting there, the German ace and the American pilot side by side, they didn't see enemies. They saw something larger. They saw proof that humanity can survive even in hell. Charlie once said in an interview, "People always ask if Franz was a hero. I tell them yes, but not because he saved me. He's a hero because he proved that mercy is stronger than war." And Franz, with his gentle smile, would reply, "No, my friend. We are both heroes, because we both kept our humanity." In truth, they didn't think of themselves as heroes at all. They were simply two men who had looked across the sky at one another and recognized the same thing: a human being doing his best to survive.